The first day ended without giving Amara the answer she had hoped for. As she lay on the narrow bed inside the staff quarters, she replayed every conversation she had witnessed. Chinedu had greeted everyone politely. He had thanked her whenever she served him. He had even shown concern for the young gardener after the flower pots broke. Nothing about his behavior suggested he was pretending. For the first time since she conceived the plan, doubt crept into her heart. Have I allowed the pain of my past to make me suspicious of a good man? She wondered. Sleep eventually came, but not before she whispered another prayer. Lord, if I am wrong about him, let me see it clearly. And if I am right, give me the strength to accept the truth, she prayed. The following morning began quietly. By 7 o'clock, the household staff had already finished most of their routine duties. Mrs. Okonkwo had left for an important board meeting in town. Before leaving, she hugged Chinedu warmly. My son, I'll back before evening, okay? There are some documents I must sign. Chinedu smiled and said, Please don't rush because of me. Mommy, I'll be fine, okay? As her vehicle disappeared through the gate, the atmosphere inside the mansion changed. For the first time since his arrival, Chinedu was in the house without any member of the Okonkwo family. Only the staff remained. Amara quietly noticed the difference. Sometimes people behave differently when those they wish to impress are no longer around. She prayed this would not be one of those times. Around 9 o'clock, Mama Grace prepared breakfast. She called Amara and told Amara, Take this to Mr. Chinedu. Amara placed the tray carefully on both hands. Fresh bread, fried eggs, tea, a plate of sliced fruit. She walked upstairs and knocked gently. Come in, Chinedu answered. She entered. He was seated near the window, reading through some architectural drawings. Without looking up, he said, Good morning. Good morning, sir. She arranged the breakfast on the small dining table. As she turned to leave, he suddenly spoke again. Excuse me. She stopped. Yes, sir. My tea isn't hot. Amara touched the teacup. It was still warm. I am sorry, sir. I will bring another one, sir. He nodded. Please do. His tone wasn't rude. It was simply firm. Within minutes, she returned with freshly prepared tea. He took one sip. Thank you. You're welcome, sir. Again, nothing unusual. Later that morning, Barrister Obi arrived to discuss some wedding documents. The meeting took place in the library. Amara entered quietly with refreshments. As she served them, she overheard part of their conversation. Barrister Obi smiled and said, The wedding plans are moving smoothly. That's good, Chinedu replied. The church has confirmed the date. And the traditional marriage, everything is almost settled. Baristobi laughed and said, I believe Chief Emmanuel would have been a very proud father. At the mention of Amara's late father, Chinedu lowered his head respectfully and said, I wish I had the opportunity to meet him. So do I, the lawyer replied. He was an extraordinary man. The conversation continued naturally. Nothing raised suspicion. Nothing suggested greed. Amara quietly left the room feeling slightly embarrassed. Perhaps this whole test has been unnecessary, she thought. By early afternoon, the weather changed. Dark clouds gathered over Enugu. A cool breeze swept across the compound before heavy rain began to fall. Most of the staff hurried indoors. Only one person remained outside, old Musa, the estate gardener. At nearly 65 years old, he was struggling to move several bags of fertilizer into the storage shed before the rain ruined them. From the upstairs balcony, Chinedu noticed him. He watched silently for a moment. Then he returned inside. Amara, who had also seen the elderly man, quickly ran downstairs. Musa, she called, leave them. You will get sick. The old gardener smiled weakly and said, If this bag spoil, Madam Grace will blame herself. I will help you. Before she could reach him, another voice interrupted. Wait! Both of them turned. It was Chinedu. He had come outside carrying an umbrella. Without saying another word, he removed his wristwatch, handed it to Amara, rolled up the sleeves of his kaftan, and lifted one of the heavy fertilizer bags onto his shoulder. Old Musa stared at him in surprise. Sir, please. It's all right, Chinedu replied. If three people carry them, we'll finish quickly, okay? He told them. For the next 10 minutes, the three of them walked together in the rain until every bag was safely stored. When they finished, Chinedu laughed softly as he wiped the rain from his face and said, There, problem solved. Old Musa folded his hands gratefully and said, God bless you, sir. Chinedu smiled and said, No. Thank God he gave us strength, okay? Standing quietly beside them, Amara felt tears gathering in her eyes. This wasn't planned. No one important was watching. There were no cameras, no audience, just an elderly gardener struggling in the rain, and Chinedu had helped him without hesitation. That evening, Amara sat alone in the staff quarters. She couldn't stop smiling. Maybe, just maybe, God had answered her prayer sooner than expected. For the first time since the engagement, she imagined herself walking down the church aisle with complete confidence. Perhaps her father had been wrong, or perhaps Chinedu truly was the kind of man her father would have admired. But life has a way of testing people when they least expect it. Sometimes kindness shown in one moment can be overshadowed by choices made when pride, pressure, or temptation enter the picture. And before the weekend was over, a conversation Chinedu never intended anyone to hear would leave Amara questioning everything she had begun to believe. For the first time since she began the secret test, Amara felt peace. The doubts that had troubled her heart were slowly disappearing. She had expected to find arrogance. She had expected to find someone who treated ordinary people differently. But what she had seen so far was a man who greeted workers, showed concern for the elderly gardener, and carried himself with humility even when nobody from the family was present. That night, she sat on the small bed inside the staff quarters, looking at the simple clothes she had been wearing for days. A small smile appeared on her face. Maybe, Daddy, she whispered. Maybe I finally found someone you would have approved of. She picked up her phone and looked at an old picture of her father. For the first time in a long while, she felt hopeful. But hope can sometimes make people lower their guard. And when people lower their guard, that is often when reality revealed itself. The next morning, Chinedu received a phone call while standing in the garden. Amara was nearby, arranging flowers. She had no intention of listening. She was simply doing her work. But then she heard a familiar voice. It was Victor, his friend. Chinedu, my brother, how far? I'm fine, oh, Chinedu replied. How is the mansion? Amara paused. The mansion? She continued arranging the flowers quietly. Chinedu laughed and said, It's a beautiful place. Victor laughed loudly through the phone and said, I told you, you entered another level. Chinedu did not respond immediately. Then Victor continued and said, Have you spoken with Amara about the family assets? A silence followed. Amara's hands stopped moving. She looked down at the flowers. For a few seconds, she thought she had heard wrongly. Then Chinedu answered and said, Not yet. Why? Because I don't want to appear interested in money, okay? Victor laughed and said, My friend, appearing interested and being interested are two different things, okay? Chinedu was silent. Victor continued and said, Look here, nobody is saying you should behave badly, but you need to understand what you are stepping into, okay? The Okonkwo family fortune is enormous. That marriage can change your entire future. Amara's heart began beating faster. She waited for Chinedu to disagree. She waited for him to say, I don't care about that. But instead, she heard him sigh and then said, Of course I know. The flowers in Amara's hand suddenly felt heavy. Later that evening, she sat alone. The conversation kept replaying in her mind. Maybe she had misunderstood. Maybe Chinedu was simply acknowledging reality. After all, money was part of every marriage discussion. She tried to convince herself, but something inside her felt unsettled. The next morning, she decided to observe more carefully, not with suspicion, with wisdom. That afternoon, a delivery man arrived at the estate carrying a package. He was a young man wearing a faded uniform. Good afternoon, he greeted the security guard. I have a delivery for Mr. Chinedu. The guard directed him inside. A few minutes later, Chinedu came downstairs. The delivery man handed him a document to sign. Please sign here, sir. Chinedu collected the pen. He signed. Then the young man accidentally dropped the envelope. I am sorry, sir. He quickly bent down to pick it up, but before he could, Chinedu stepped back. Be careful. The delivery man apologized again. Yes, sir. Amara watched quietly. Nothing terrible had happened, but she noticed something. Chinedu's tone with wealthy visitors was warm and relaxed. With ordinary workers, it was different. Not openly cruel, just distant, almost as if they belonged to another world. That evening, Amara went to Mama Grace. The older woman was folding clothes in the laundry room. Mama Grace, the woman looked up. Yes, my daughter, can I ask you something? Of course. Have you noticed anything about Chinedu since he arrived? Mama Grace became quiet. What do you mean? I mean, does he treat everyone the same? Mama Grace continued folding the clothes. Then she smiled slightly and said, You have started seeing. Amara looked at her. Seeing what? The little things. What little things? Mama Grace placed the folded clothes aside and then said, My daughter, a person does not reveal their heart only through big actions. Sometimes it is in the small things, the way they speak to someone serving them, the way they react when nobody important is watching, the way they treat people who cannot benefit them. Amara lowered her eyes and said, Do you think he's pretending? Mama Grace sighed and answered and said, I don't know. And I don't want to accuse a man without proof. But remember why you started this? Amara nodded slowly and said, To discover the truth. Exactly, Mama Grace said. 2 days later, something happened that changed everything. The estate hosted a small dinner with some business associates. Amara's mother had returned from her trip. Several important guests arrived, and once again, Chinedu became the perfect gentleman. He greeted everyone. He laughed warmly. He complimented the food. He helped Mrs. Okonkwo with her chair. Everyone admired him. He is such a respectful young man, one of the guests said. Amara stood quietly at the side, carrying a tray. She watched. The man everyone saw and the man she was beginning to discover were becoming two different people. After dinner, while the guests were leaving, one of the younger staff members accidentally delayed bringing Chinedu's car keys. The young worker, Peter, searched frantically and he said, I am sorry, sir. I thought I placed them on the table. Chinedu's expression changed and he said, How can you be this careless? Peter lowered his head and said, I apologize, sir. You people don't understand responsibility, Chinedu told him. The room became quiet. Amara watched carefully. Chinedu looked around and noticed the guests had already left. His voice became sharper. Next time, think before you act, okay? Peter nodded. Yes, sir. Chinedu walked away. A few minutes later, he returned to the sitting room. His smile was back. His calm personality had returned. But Amara had seen something, a small crack, a glimpse behind the mask. That night, Amara could not sleep. She stared at the ceiling for hours. She remembered the gardener. She remembered the kind words. She remembered the rain. Then she remembered the phone call, the questions, the change in his voice, the way he spoke when he believed nobody important was listening. For the first time, she wondered if both versions of Chinedu were real. Perhaps he was not completely bad. Perhaps he was not completely good either. Perhaps the truth was somewhere in between. And that was more dangerous because the easiest people to trust are not always the ones who are completely good. They are the ones who are good enough to make you ignore the warning signs. The following day would bring the biggest test yet, a test that will reveal whether Chinedu loved Amara or whether he loved everything that came with her name. The following morning, Amara woke up earlier than usual. She sat quietly on the edge of the bed inside the staff quarters, thinking about everything she had witnessed. Her heart was confused. That was the part that hurt the most. If Chinedu had been completely arrogant from the beginning, walking away would have been easy. But he wasn't. He had shown kindness. He had shown patience. He had helped old Musa in the rain. He had spoken gently to her mother. He had done many things that made her believe he was different. Yet, she had also seen moments that troubled her. Small moments, almost invisible moments. The kind most people ignored until it was too late. She remembered something her father once told her, and he said, "A person's true nature is not revealed by one action, it is revealed by a pattern." And now she needed to know the pattern. That afternoon, Mrs. Okonkwo and Barrister Obi met privately in the study. The plan had entered a new stage. They needed one final test, not a cruel test, not a trap, just a situation that will reveal Chinedu's priorities. Barrister B placed some documents on the table and he said, "We must be careful." Mrs. Okonkwo nodded and said, "I agree. We cannot create a false story that destroys someone's reputation." "I understand." The lawyer looked toward Amara and said, "The purpose is not to punish him. It is to give him an opportunity to show who he truly is." Amara nodded and said, "What will we do then?" Barrister B opened one of the files and said, "We will simply allow him to believe that the family's financial situation is not as perfect as he assumes." Mr. Okonkwo looked thoughtfully and said, "Meaning?" "We don't tell him the family has lost everything. No lies. We only allow him to hear that some investments have suffered losses and that some wedding plans may need adjustments." Amara understood. It was not about pretending to be poor. It was about removing the comfort of certainty to see whether love remained when luxury became uncertain. That evening, the family gathered for dinner. Chinedu sat beside Amara's mother. Although Amara was serving quietly as a maid, she was listening carefully. Mrs. Okonkwo deliberately brought up a business matter and she said, "Barrister B mentioned today that some of our foreign investments have not performed as expected." Chinedu looked up and said, "Oh, yes," she calmly continued. "Nothing serious, but some decisions may need to be reviewed." Barrister B nodded and said, "The economy has affected many businesses." Chinedu placed his spoon down and said, "I understand." Mrs. Okonkwo smiled and said, "Sometimes even successful families face difficult seasons." Of course, the conversation moved on. Nobody said anything else. But Amara noticed for the first time Chinedu became unusually quiet. Later that night, Chinedu called Victor. He stood outside on the balcony, believing nobody could hear him. But Amara was passing through the hallway nearby. She stopped when she heard her name. "Victor, I don't know what is happening." Oh. Her heart immediately tightened. "What do you mean?" Victor asked. Chinedu lowered his voice and said, "Her mother mentioned some financial problems." "Financial problems?" "Yes." Victor laughed. "Are you serious?" "I don't know how serious it is." There was a pause. Then Victor asked and said, "Does Amara know?" She wasn't there. Amara froze. She was standing only a few meters away. Then Victor spoke again and said, "My friend, be careful." "Careful?" "Yes. You know why you are marrying her." Silence. A painful silence. Amara waited. She wanted to hear Chinedu defend himself. She wanted him to say, "No, you are wrong. I love her." But his response came quietly, and he said, "I need to understand the situation first." Those words entered her heart like a heavy stone, not because they proved everything, but because they revealed uncertainty. A man deeply in love would worry about the woman, not the size of the fortune. The next morning, Chinedu's behavior changed slightly, not dramatically. That would have been too obvious. But Amara noticed he asked fewer questions about her. He spent more time on his phone. He seemed distracted. When Mrs. Okonkwo mentioned postponing the purchase of a new property after the wedding, he immediately asked and said, "How long do you think the situation will last?" Her mother answered calmly and said, "That depends on the market." Chinedu nodded and said, "I understand." But his face showed disappointment. That afternoon, another incident happened. One of the cleaners, a woman named Ngozi, accidentally damaged a decorative curtain while trying to remove stains. The curtain was expensive. Ngozi immediately panicked and said, "Madam will deduct my salary." Oh." She began apologizing. When Chinedu walked past, she explained what happened and she said, "I am sorry, sir. I made a mistake." Chinedu looked at the damaged curtain, then looked at her and said, "Do you know how much this cost?" Ngozi lowered her head. "No, sir." "Of course you don't," he said. His words were not loud, but they carried weight. Amara watched from the corner. Chinedu continued and said, "These things don't just appear here. They are paid for." Ngozi nodded and said, "Yes, sir." Then he walked away. No comfort, no question about whether she could afford the mistake. Nothing. Later, Mama Grace quietly repaired the situation. That evening, Amara sat with her mother for the first time since beginning the test. Tears filled her eyes, and she said, "I wanted to believe he was different." Mrs. Okonkwo held her hand and said, "Sometimes the truth hurts because we were hoping for something else." Amara wiped her tears and said, "But I still don't know." Her mother nodded and said, "Then don't decide yet. Watch. Let the truth reveal itself completely, okay?" 3 days later, the final stage of the test would begin. The family would announce that due to financial pressure, some wedding arrangements would be simplified. No extravagant reception, no unnecessary luxury, just a simple celebration. A normal person would see it as a small adjustment. But for someone who had hidden intentions, it will feel like losing everything. And when Chinedu heard the announcement, his reaction will reveal the answer Amara had been searching for. Because sometimes people don't change when they lose money. They simply reveal who they were all along. The announcement was made on a quiet Saturday afternoon. There was no drama, no warning, no reason for anyone to suspect that it was part of a plan. The Okonkwo family sat together in the main sitting room. Mrs. Ifeoma Okonkwo looked at Chinedu with a calm expression and then said, "My son, there is something we need to discuss concerning the wedding." Chinedu immediately became attentive and said, "Is everything all right, mommy?" She nodded and said, "Everything is fine. However, because of some changes in our business investments, we have decided to make some adjustments." Chinedu listened carefully and she continued and said, "The wedding will still happen, but instead of the large celebration we initially planned, we may choose something simpler, a smaller gathering, less unnecessary spending." The room became quiet. Amara stood near the corner of the room holding a tray. She watched every movement, every expression, every reaction. At first, Chinedu said nothing. Then he smiled slightly and said, "I understand." Mrs. Okonkwo smiled and said, "Thank you for understanding." But Amara noticed something. His smile did not reach his eyes. That evening, Chinedu was unusually quiet. Normally, he would call Amara after dinner and talk for hours. But that night, no call, no message, nothing. The following morning, he suddenly announced that he needed to return to Lagos for some urgent work. Mrs. Okonkwo looked surprised and said, You are leaving today? Yes, mommy, I have some matters to handle. But you were supposed to stay until Tuesday. I know. He smiled politely and said, something unexpected came up. Amara listened quietly. Something about his explanation felt incomplete. Later that day, Victor called again. This time, Chinedu answered while sitting in the garden. Amara was nearby cleaning the outdoor chairs. She had no intention of listening, but once again, his words caught her attention. So, what are you going to do? Victor asked. Chinedu sighed and said, I don't know yet. About the wedding? Yes. Victor lowered his voice and said, my friend, you have to think carefully. Oh. I know. You entered this relationship because you believed your future would be secured. Chinedu did not respond. Victor continued and said, if the situation has changed, you understand what I mean, okay? For several seconds, only silence came through the phone. Then Chinedu finally spoke and said, I just need time to think. Amara slowly placed the cloth in her hand on the table. Her heart sank. Those words were not a confession, but they were not a defense either. That night, something unexpected happened. Amara was walking through the hallway when she heard voices coming from the guest room. It was Chinedu and her mother. She stopped before entering. I hope you don't misunderstand me, Mrs. Okonkwo, Chinedu was saying. Her heart tightened. I only want clarity. Her mother replied calmly and said, clarity about what? About the future. The future? Yes. He paused and said, I need to know if Amara's lifestyle will remain the same after marriage. Amara closed her eyes. There it was, the question she had been waiting for. Not about her happiness, not about their relationship, not about building a home together, about lifestyle. Mrs. Okonkwo remained calm, then answered and said, my son, are you saying your love depends on financial circumstances? Of course not. Then why are you asking this? Another silence. Then Chinedu answered and said, I just believe a man should know what he's entering into. Amara stepped away before hearing more. She didn't want to hear another word because sometimes the heart protects itself from pain by refusing to listen. The next morning, Amara made a decision. The test had gone far enough. She had her answer, not because Chinedu had done one terrible thing, not because he had openly admitted greed, but because she has seen something more important. She has seen his priorities. She has seen how his confidence changed when he believed wealth was uncertain. She has seen how kindness became easier when there was something to gain. And she had learned a painful truth. A person can be polite and still be selfish. A person can have good manners and still have the wrong motives. However, before Amara could reveal herself, something happened that she never expected. That afternoon, while she was carrying laundry, she heard Chinedu speaking with one of the house staff members. It was Peter, the young worker who had misplaced his car keys. Chinedu's voice was different, angry, and he said, you people think money grows on trees, Abi? Peter lowered his head and said, no, sir. Then why are you careless? I am sorry, sir. I don't want excuses. Amara stopped walking. The same man who had once comforted Samuel, the gardener, was now humiliating Peter. But then something else happened. Peter quietly said, sir, my mother is sick. I have been distracted because I am trying to raise money for her treatment. For a moment, Chinedu became silent. Amara watched carefully. She waited. Would he show compassion? Would he remember that this was a human being standing before him? Then Chinedu reached into his pocket. He brought out some money. Peter looked surprised. Sir, take this. Go and take care of your mother, okay? Peter's eyes filled with gratitude. Thank you, sir. Chinedu nodded. But don't let your work suffer, okay? Yes, sir. He walked away. Amara stood there confused again. The same question returned. Who was Chinedu? Was he a bad person? Was he simply imperfect? Was he a man struggling between kindness and pride? The truth was becoming more complicated. And perhaps that was the hardest part because The most dangerous people are not always those who are completely evil. Sometimes they are people with good qualities, but weaknesses they refuse to confront. That evening, Amara sat with Mama Grace and said, I don't know what to do. The older woman looked at her and said, You've seen enough, but he isn't completely bad. No one is. That is what makes decision difficult. Amara looked down and said, I wanted a simple answer. Mama Grace smiled sadly and said, Life rarely gives simple answers. She held Amara's hand and then said, Ask yourself one question. What kind of man will he become when life becomes difficult? Amara remained silent because that was the question she had been avoiding. The next day was the day of the engagement dinner, the day Amara would finally remove the disguise. But before she revealed herself, she had one final thing to do. She would allow Chinedu to make one last choice, a choice that would determine whether he deserved another chance or whether she would walk away forever. And this time, there would be no pretending. The engagement dinner arrived within an atmosphere of celebration. The Okonkwo estate was beautifully decorated. Soft lights illuminated the compound. Fresh flowers lined the walkway. Family members, close friends, and respected guests arrived one after another on a way that the evening would become a turning point in everyone's lives. To them, it was simply another step toward a beautiful wedding. But to Amara, it was the day she would finally stop hiding. Inside the staff quarters, she looked at the simple mess uniform lying on the bed. She touched the fabric gently. For almost 2 weeks, this clothing had allowed her to see a side of life she had always known existed, but rarely experienced. She had learned that many people noticed wealth before they noticed humanity. She had learned that respect should never depend on someone's position. And most importantly, she had learned the truth about the man she was about to marry. Mama Grace entered quietly and said, My daughter. Amara turned. The older woman smiled sadly and said, It is time. Amara nodded and said, Yes. Are you ready? She took a deep breath and then said, I am. Downstairs, Chinedu was dressed in an expensive traditional outfit. He looked confident. He greeted guests warmly. Anyone watching him would believe he was the perfect future husband. But inside, his mind was troubled. The past few days had been uncomfortable. He knew Amara's family had noticed his questions about their finances. He knew he had not handled everything perfectly. But he convinced himself that he had only been trying to understand his future. After all, wasn't it normal for someone to consider their future? That was what he kept telling himself. During dinner, Mrs. Okonkwo stood up. The room became quiet, and she said, I want to thank everyone for coming today. We are grateful for the love and support shown to our family. Everyone smiled. Then she looked toward Chinedu and said, Before we continue, there is someone I believe everyone here needs to meet. Chinedu smiled. He assumed she was about to introduce someone important, perhaps another family member, perhaps a guest. Nobody expected what happened next. The door opened. Mama Grace walked in first. Behind her was Amara, but not the maid they had all seen for days. The woman who entered wore an elegant traditional outfit decorated with beautiful details. Her hair was perfectly styled. Her jewelry shone under the lights. Her confidence filled the room. The guests stood in surprise. Chinedu stared. His face slowly changed. Confusion, shock, disbelief, and he shouted and said, No! The word escaped his lips quietly. Amra looked directly at him and said, Yes, Chinedu, it's me. The room became completely silent. For several moments, nobody spoke. Then Chinedu stood slowly and said, Amara, I don't understand. She nodded and said, I know. That is why I wanted you to see everything before I explained. His eyes moved from her elegant appearance to Mama Grace, then to the staff member standing quietly behind her. You knew? Mama Grace lowered her head and said, Yes, sir. Chinedu looked around the room. He suddenly understood. Every conversation, every interaction, every moment, everything had been observed. Baristobi stepped forward and said, Mr. Chinedu, before anyone makes accusation, allow Miss Amara to speak. Amara looked around the room. Her voice was calm and she said, I did not do this because I wanted to embarrass you. I did not do this because I wanted to trap you. I did this because I needed to know whether the man I was preparing to marry respected people who could do nothing for him. Chinedu lowered his eyes. She continued and said, For many days, you believed I was just a maid. You believed I had no wealth, no influence, no importance. And during those days, I saw different sides of you. She paused, then continued and said, I saw kindness. I saw generosity. I saw moments that made me believe I had chosen the right man. Chinedu looked up slightly. Hope appeared briefly in his eyes. But then Amara continued and said, I also saw moments that hurt me. I had conversations about my family's wealth. I saw how your attitude changed when you believed my family's financial situation was uncertain. I saw how differently you treated people depending on their position. The room remained silent. Chinedu swallowed hard and said, Amara, I can explain. She nodded and said, I know you can. Everyone always has an explanation, but explanations cannot erase patterns. He looked at her and said, I love you. Amara's eyes became emotional and she said, I wanted to believe that. And perhaps part of you does love me. But love without the right character cannot build a peaceful home. Victor, who had attended the dinner, quietly looked away. He realized his conversations with Chinedu had contributed to everything. Chinedu turned toward Amara and said, So this means the wedding is cancelled? Amara took a deep breath and then answered and said, I don't know if you are a bad man, Chinedu. I don't believe you are. But I know that the man I need to marry must understand something. She stepped closer and continued and said, Rich or poor, powerful or unknown, every person deserves dignity. The cleaner, the gardener, the security guard, the person serving food, how you treat them reveals your heart. Chinedu stood silently. For the first time, he had no clever answer. No explanation, no defense, only reflection. Then he quietly removed the engagement ring from his pocket. He looked at it for a moment, then placed it on the table and said, I am sorry. His voice was low, not because I lost a wealthy bride, but because I failed to become the kind of man I wanted people to believe I was. Nobody spoke. Amara looked at him with sadness. Perhaps his apology was genuine. Perhaps it was the beginning of change. But some lessons must be learned before marriage, not inside marriage. Then he walked away. 6 months later, the Okonkwo Foundation opened a new community center in Enugu. The center provided training, education, and support for young people from less privileged backgrounds. During the opening ceremony, Amara stood before hundreds of people. She looked around at the crowd. Among them were workers, business owners, students, mothers, fathers, people from different walks of life, all standing together. She smiled because she had learned something important. A person's value is never measured by their bank account. Chinedu also changed. The experience humbled him. He spent months reflecting on himself. He began volunteering. He treated workers differently, not because someone was watching, But because he finally understood a person's character is who they are when there is nothing to gain. 1 year later, Amara met Daniel. He was not a billionaire. He did not own a chain of companies. He did not come from a famous family. But she noticed something about him. Whenever they visited restaurants, he thanked the waiters. Whenever they met security guards, he greeted them. Whenever someone needed help, he offered it without looking around to see who was watching. And that was when Amara realized the test she created years earlier was never truly about finding a perfect man. It was about finding a man whose heart was already in the right place. On their wedding day, Amara remembered her father's words, which says, "Watch how people treat those who have nothing to offer them." She finally understood. True wealth was never found in houses, cars, businesses, or bank accounts. True wealth was found in character. Thank you for watching. This is where our story ends. But as Amara's story comes to an end, one powerful truth remains, which says people may be able to hide their intentions with beautiful words, expensive clothes, and impressive appearances, but character will always reveal itself through actions. The way we treat people who serve us reveals our hearts. The way we speak to those who cannot promote us reveals our humility. The way we behave when no one is watching reveals who we truly are. A person's job title does not determine their value. A cleaner deserves respect. A security guard deserves respect. A driver deserves respect. A waiter deserves respect. A poor person deserves respect because every human being carries dignity given by God. This story also teaches us that love is not built on wealth, beauty, status, or what someone can provide. True love is built on respect, honesty, humility, compassion, good character. Never choose someone only because they look successful. Look deeper. Observe how they treat people around them because someone who cannot respect others will eventually struggle to respect you. And remember this, a person who is kind only when important people are watching is not truly kind. Real kindness happens in secret. Real character appears when there is nothing to gain. If this story touched your heart, please and please don't forget to like this video, subscribe to Olu Beauty African Folktales, and share this story with someone who needs this message. And please don't forget to touch the bell button so that you'll be notified each time we put out new video. Leave a comment below. Character is the greatest wealth. Let us know what lesson you learned from Amara's journey. Thank you once again for watching, and may we always remember that the greatest treasure a person can have is not what they own, but the goodness they carry inside their hearts. God bless you all for watching. Love you. Bye bye. Mwah.